On January 15, 2025, a significant ceasefire agreement was reached between Israel and the Palestinian Islamic resistance movement commonly known as Hamas. This agreement was the result of extensive mediation efforts by Qatar, Egypt, and the United States and is scheduled to take effect on January 19, 2025. Key elements of the ceasefire agreement. The ceasefire agreement encompasses several essential components aimed at halting the ongoing conflict and addressing humanitarian needs. 1. Ceasefire implementation. The agreement mandates an immediate cessation of hostilities in the Gaza Strip. This cessation is critical to restoring some level of normalcy and safety for civilians caught in the conflict. 2. Hostage and prisoner exchange. A pivotal aspect of the deal involves a phased exchange of hostages and prisoners. In the first phase, Hamas is expected to release 33 Israeli hostages, which include civilians, women, children, and the elderly. In return, a number of Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli facilities will be released. This exchange is seen not only as a humanitarian gesture but also as a step towards building trust between the conflicting parties. 3. Humanitarian aid. The agreement explicitly outlines the need for the safe and effective entry of humanitarian aid into the Gaza region. This includes provisions for rebuilding critical infrastructure such as hospitals, health centers, and bakeries, as well as ensuring that civil defense supplies and fuel reach those in need. 4. Phased approach. The ceasefire is structured in multiple phases, with the initial phase lasting 42 days. The specifics of subsequent phases will be negotiated and finalized during the implementation of the first phase. This phased approach is intended to ensure that both parties adhere to the terms of the agreement while allowing for adjustments as necessary. International reactions. The announcement of the ceasefire agreement was met with a mix of relief and skepticism from various international stakeholders. Expressions of support. Organizations like the World Health Organization (WHO) welcomed the ceasefire, emphasizing the urgent need for humanitarian assistance in Gaza. Similarly, U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders described the ceasefire as long overdue, urging all parties to honor the agreement and allow humanitarian aid to flow unhindered. Skepticism and concerns. Despite the optimism surrounding the agreement, some Israeli officials expressed concerns about its implications for national security. Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich criticized the agreement as bad and dangerous, suggesting that it could undermine security and embolden Hamas. Celebration in Gaza. In the Gaza Strip, many Palestinians expressed their relief and joy at the news of the ceasefire. The prospect of returning to their homes, even those that may be destroyed, provided a glimmer of hope amidst the devastation of over a year of conflict. Background context. The ceasefire comes in the wake of a prolonged conflict that escalated dramatically in October 2023. Following the initial outbreak of hostilities, various attempts at mediation had been made, with Qatar playing a crucial role in facilitating discussions. A previous ceasefire in November 2023 had allowed for the release of 109 hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners, setting a precedent for this latest agreement. The negotiations leading up to the agreement were described as intense, with continuous meetings among representatives from Qatar, Egypt, the United States, Hamas, and Israeli officials over several days. The collaborative efforts of the mediators were critical in bridging the gaps between the conflicting parties and pushing the negotiations forward. The role of the mediators. The roles of Qatar, Egypt, and the United States were highlighted as instrumental in the successful negotiation of the ceasefire. Qatar's Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman bin Jassim Al Thani expressed gratitude to the mediating countries and emphasized the need for all parties to comply fully with the terms of the agreement to ensure civilian safety and a sustainable peace. Future considerations. While the ceasefire agreement is a crucial step towards ending the violence, analysts and stakeholders recognize that its success will depend on the commitment of both parties to adhere to the terms laid out. There are calls for continued international oversight to ensure compliance and to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid. The agreement is viewed as an opportunity to move towards a more lasting peace in the region, with hopes that it will pave the way for further negotiations aimed at addressing the underlying issues that have fueled the conflict for decades. Conclusion. The January 15, 2025 ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas represents a significant moment in the ongoing struggle for peace in the Middle East. While it offers a temporary respite from violence and a framework for humanitarian assistance, the path to a lasting resolution remains fraught with challenges. The international community's role in supporting the implementation of this agreement will be vital in ensuring that it leads to a more stable and peaceful future for both Israelis and Palestinians. The ceasefire agreement reached on January 15, 2025 between Israel and Hamas is marked by several counterintuitive elements that challenge conventional narratives about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Here are some of the key points. 1. Role of non-traditional mediators. The involvement of Qatar as a mediator is particularly noteworthy. While historically the U.S. has been seen as the dominant force in Middle Eastern diplomacy, Qatar's active role in brokering peace reflects a shift towards smaller states exerting significant influence in international conflict resolution. This counters the expectation that only major powers can lead in such negotiations. 2. Hamas's position and strategy. Hamas's agreement to a ceasefire and the release of hostages can be perceived as a sign of weakness, yet it can also be interpreted as a strategic move to consolidate its power and legitimacy among Palestinians. By framing the ceasefire as a victory against Israeli aggression, Hamas can bolster its standing domestically, contradicting the narrative that such agreements signify a loss of agency for resistance movements. 3. The complexity of humanitarian aid. The agreement emphasizes the need for humanitarian assistance, which is often viewed as a straightforward necessity. However, the stipulation for a safe and effective entry of aid complicates matters. It suggests that humanitarian aid can be used as a bargaining chip in negotiations, which counters the expectation that humanitarian needs should be addressed unconditionally and underscores the politicization of aid in conflict zones. 4. International reactions. The varied responses from global leaders illustrate a complex landscape where support for the ceasefire does not translate into uniform approval of the parties involved. For example, U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders' statement calling for accountability on both sides highlights a growing recognition of the need for a balanced approach, contrary to the traditional U.S. stance, which often unconditionally supports Israel. 5. Contradictory Israeli reactions. Within Israel, there are starkly divided opinions about the ceasefire agreement. While some leaders like Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich view the deal as dangerous for national security, others may see it as a necessary step towards stability. This internal contradiction reveals the complexities within Israeli politics, where national security concerns clash with the need for diplomatic resolution, challenging the binary view of Israeli leadership as uniformly hawkish. 6. Temporary versus permanent solutions. The agreement is portrayed as a multi-phased approach, potentially leading to a permanent ceasefire. This nuanced structure contrasts with the typical expectation that ceasefires are often temporary and fragile. By outlining a phased implementation, the parties may be attempting to build a framework for lasting peace, which counters the narrative of perpetual conflict. 7. Public sentiment in Gaza. The reaction of displaced Palestinians celebrating the ceasefire despite the devastation of their homes highlights a counterintuitive emotional resilience. This demonstrates that even amidst destruction there is a profound desire for peace, which can challenge the perception of Palestinians solely as victims of violence. 8. Political leverage through hostage exchange. The exchange of hostages as part of the ceasefire agreement complicates the moral landscape of conflict resolution. It raises questions about the ethics of negotiating with groups labeled as terrorists and suggests that such negotiations can yield tangible outcomes, countering the narrative that violence is the only path to achieving political goals. These counterintuitive elements indicate a more complex reality in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than is often portrayed, suggesting that the dynamics of power agency and humanitarian considerations are interlinked in ways that challenge traditional narratives. The ceasefire agreement reached on January 15, 2025 between Israel and Hamas, mediated by the United States, Qatar and Egypt, is a significant development in the long-standing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. While much of the reporting emphasizes the immediate implications of the ceasefire and the exchange of hostages, several important aspects may be overlooked that carry long-term significance for the region and international relations. 1. Multi-phased approach and long-term stability. The agreement is structured in multiple phases, starting with a 42-day period focused on the exchange of hostages and prisoners. This phased approach is crucial because it allows for incremental trust building between the parties involved. The significance of this cannot be overstated. Previous agreements have often faltered due to lack of trust and immediate implementation. The phased nature of the current agreement is designed to ensure that parties can work collaboratively toward a longer-term peace rather than expecting immediate results that can lead to disappointment and potential resumption of hostilities. 2. Humanitarian aid and reconstruction efforts. A key component of the ceasefire is the restoration of humanitarian aid and the rebuilding of Gaza's infrastructure, including hospitals and bakeries. This aspect may be underreported, yet it is pivotal for regional stability. The humanitarian situation in Gaza has been dire, and effective aid delivery can alleviate suffering and foster goodwill among the Palestinian population. The role of humanitarian aid as a peacebuilding tool is often overlooked, but it can contribute significantly to reducing tensions and building a foundation for future negotiations. 3. The role of mediators. The agreement highlights the significant roles played by Qatar, Egypt, and the United States as mediators. While the United States often receives attention as a key player in Middle Eastern politics, Qatar's involvement is frequently underestimated. Qatar's position as a mediator underscores its growing influence in the region, balancing its relations with both Western powers and Palestinian factions. This dynamic may reshape future mediation efforts and diplomatic relations in the Middle East, as smaller nations like Qatar assert themselves in conflict resolution. 4. Domestic reactions and political implications. The domestic reactions to the ceasefire, particularly from Israeli and Palestinian officials, reveal underlying tensions that could affect the agreement's longevity. In Israel, some leaders view the ceasefire as a threat to national security, suggesting a division in public sentiment about the peace process. Similarly, Hamas's portrayal of the ceasefire as a victory may complicate future negotiations if it is perceived as a concession rather than a step toward peace. These political dynamics can influence the effectiveness of the ceasefire and highlight the fragility of such agreements. 5. International reactions and accountability. International responses to the ceasefire particularly calls for accountability for war crimes on both sides, reflect a growing recognition of the need for justice in conflict resolution. Figures like Senator Bernie Sanders emphasize the importance of not only achieving a ceasefire but also addressing the underlying issues that have perpetuated the conflict. This focus on accountability may signal a shift in how international actors engage with future peace processes, pushing for more comprehensive approaches that include justice and reparations. 6. The future of Gaza and governance. The agreement's implications for governance in Gaza are also significant. The potential for a Palestinian Authority to manage the Rafah crossing and other border crossings could lead to a shift in the political landscape. If the Palestinian Authority can assert more control and provide stability, it may bolster its legitimacy among Palestinians and create a counterbalance to groups like Hamas. This shift could influence future governance models in Palestinian territories and affect relations with Israel and neighboring countries. 7. The impact of external powers. The role of external powers, particularly the influence of the United States under the incoming Trump administration, should not be overlooked. The pressure exerted by the Trump administration on Israel to finalize the agreement indicates a strategic shift in U.S. involvement in the Middle East. This could signal a new era of U.S. diplomacy that emphasizes negotiation and compromise, although it also raises questions about the consistency of U.S. policy in the region. The ability of external powers to mediate effectively may depend on their credibility and the perception of their motives by the parties involved. 8. Monitoring and compliance mechanisms. The establishment of follow-up mechanisms involving Qatar, Egypt, and the United States to monitor the implementation of the ceasefire is a critical aspect of the agreement. These mechanisms are designed to ensure compliance and address any violations swiftly. The significance of this lies in the historical context. Previous agreements often lacked robust monitoring systems, leading to their collapse. The presence of ongoing oversight can foster accountability and build confidence among the parties. Conclusion. While the immediate implications of the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas are important, the overlooked aspects discussed above are equally significant. The multi-phased approach, the role of mediators, humanitarian aid restoration, and the political dynamics on both sides all contribute to the complexity and potential for a lasting peace. As the situation evolves, the international community must remain engaged and vigilant to ensure that the terms of the agreement are honored and that the underlying causes of the conflict are addressed comprehensively. 1. Content and structure of the ceasefire agreement. The ceasefire agreement reached on January 15, 2025 between Israel and Hamas entails a multifaceted approach to halting hostilities, focusing on the exchange of hostages and prisoners. Specifically, it outlines that Hamas will release 33 Israeli hostages in exchange for a number of Palestinian prisoners. The inclusion of a phased approach with a defined timeline for the implementation of humanitarian aid and restoration efforts in Gaza signifies a structured attempt to address both immediate and longer-term needs of the affected population. 2. International mediation and cooperation. The roles of Qatar, Egypt, and the United States are pivotal in the negotiation process, highlighting the importance of international diplomacy in conflict resolution. The acknowledgement of these mediators by the involved parties indicates a recognition of the need for external support in achieving a sustainable peace. The success of the agreement is contingent upon the mediators' commitment to monitoring compliance and facilitating further dialogue, as emphasized by Qatari officials. 3. Humanitarian considerations. The agreement prioritizes the restoration of humanitarian aid to Gaza, a critical aspect given the region's dire conditions following prolonged conflict. The commitment to rehabilitate essential services such as hospitals and bakeries is a vital step towards addressing the immediate humanitarian crises. International responses, including endorsements from organizations like the World Health Organization and the World Food Programme, underscore the urgent need for humanitarian access and support, stressing that the ceasefire should be viewed as a starting point rather than the conclusion of aid efforts. 4. Political dynamics and reactions. The ceasefire has elicited mixed reactions from various stakeholders, reflecting the complex political landscape surrounding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. While Hamas characterized the agreement as a victory, Israeli officials expressed concerns regarding national security implications. The varying interpretations of the ceasefire's significance by different political groups, including criticisms from within the Israeli government and support from international figures like Senator Bernie Sanders, illustrate the multifaceted impact of the agreement on regional and international politics. These dynamics will play a crucial role in shaping the future of the peace process and the potential for lasting stability in the region. Here are 3 famous historical cases similar to the content of the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. 1. Camp David Accords, 1978. The Camp David Accords were a series of agreements brokered by U.S. President Jimmy Carter between Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. The negotiations took place at Camp David in Maryland, USA in September 1978 and resulted in a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt the following year. The accords included frameworks for the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the Sinai Peninsula, which Israel had occupied since the Six-Day War in 1967, and established diplomatic relations between the two nations. The accords were a significant step toward peace in the Middle East, although they were met with mixed reactions within both countries and the broader Arab world. 2. Oslo Accords 1993. The Oslo Accords were a landmark series of agreements between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization (PLO) aimed at achieving a peace process and a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The first agreement was signed in Washington, D.C. on September 13, 1993, and marked the first time that the two sides officially recognized each other. The accords established the Palestinian Authority and outlined a framework for the eventual establishment of a Palestinian state. While the accords initially raised hopes for peace, they faced numerous challenges, including violence, political disagreements, and issues related to territory and refugees, which have continued to this day. 3. Good Friday Agreement 1998. The Good Friday Agreement, also known as the Belfast Agreement, was a major political development in Northern Ireland aimed at ending decades of conflict known as the Troubles. The agreement was reached on April 10, 1998, after extensive negotiations involving multiple parties, including the British and Irish governments as well as various Northern Irish political groups. The agreement established a devolved government for Northern Ireland, created frameworks for cooperation between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and set out provisions for disarmament and the release of political prisoners. The Good Friday Agreement was pivotal in reducing violence and fostering a more stable political environment in Northern Ireland, though challenges remain in its implementation and in addressing issues of identity and governance. The ceasefire agreement reached on January 15, 2025 between Israel and Hamas, mediated by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt, represents a critical juncture in the long-standing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Set to take effect on January 19, this agreement aims not only to halt hostilities but also to facilitate humanitarian assistance and a phased exchange of prisoners. Predictions for the future. 1. Short-term stability in Gaza. The immediate effect of the ceasefire will likely be a reduction in violence in Gaza, allowing humanitarian organizations to access the region and provide necessary aid. With the phased release of hostages and prisoners, there may be a temporary thaw in tensions, fostering a sense of hope among the civilian population that sustained peace might be possible. 2. Humanitarian efforts and reconstruction. The agreement emphasizes the need for humanitarian aid and the reconstruction of essential services in Gaza. Organizations like the World Food Programme and WHO are poised to ramp up their support. However, the success of these efforts will depend on the security situation and the cooperation of both parties to maintain peace and allow for the unhindered flow of aid. 3. Political ramifications. Domestically, the ceasefire may shift the political landscape in Israel and Palestine. In Israel, the government may face pressure from right-wing factions who view any concessions to Hamas as a threat to national security. Conversely, Hamas may seek to consolidate its power by capitalizing on the perception of having secured a victory, potentially leading to further escalations in rhetoric and actions if the peace process falters. 4. International involvement and pressure. The role of the United States, Qatar, and Egypt in mediating this agreement will likely increase their influence in the region. Future negotiations will require sustained international attention to ensure compliance with the ceasefire terms. The Biden administration, along with incoming leadership, may push for a more proactive approach to peace negotiations, potentially involving broader regional stakeholders. 5. Long-term ceasefire prospects. While the current ceasefire is a positive development, its long-term sustainability is uncertain. Continued hostilities or provocations could lead to a breakdown of trust. A failure to address underlying issues such as territorial disputes, the status of Jerusalem, and security concerns may result in a return to violence. 6. Regional dynamics. The ceasefire could influence broader Middle Eastern geopolitics. Countries like Iran and Turkey, which have historically supported Hamas, may reassess their strategies in response to shifts in power dynamics. Simultaneously, normalization agreements between Israel and other Arab states could be tested, depending on how the ceasefire unfolds. 7. Public sentiment and grassroots movements. The ceasefire may catalyze grassroots movements on both sides advocating for peace and reconciliation. Public sentiment in Israel and Palestine will be critical in shaping future policies. A significant portion of the populations weary of conflict may push for negotiations that lead to a more permanent solution. 8. Monitoring and compliance mechanisms. A robust framework for monitoring compliance with the ceasefire will be essential. The establishment of a joint committee involving mediating nations to oversee the implementation and address violations can help maintain the ceasefire's integrity. Failure to monitor compliance may lead to renewed hostilities. 9. Impact on future negotiations. This ceasefire could set a precedent for future negotiations. Successful implementation may lead to more comprehensive talks addressing long-standing issues including borders, refugees, and the status of Jerusalem. Conversely, any violations could entrench skepticism and hinder future dialogue. 10. Emerging voices and leadership. As the conflict evolves, new leaders and voices within both Israeli and Palestinian societies may emerge advocating for innovative solutions and approaches to the conflict. Engaging these emerging leaders in dialogue could pave the way for a more inclusive peace process. Conclusion. The ceasefire agreement achieved on January 15, 2025 offers a glimmer of hope for a region long plagued by violence. While the immediate future may witness a respite in hostilities and a focus on humanitarian needs, the challenges of establishing a sustainable peace remain formidable. Continued international engagement, adherence to the agreement, and a commitment to addressing the root causes of the conflict will be essential for fostering long-term stability in the region. The coming months will be pivotal in determining whether this ceasefire can evolve into a pathway toward lasting peace or if it will succumb to the cycles of violence that have characterized the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for decades.